It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 526 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record, where I hold in-depth conversations with today's leading experts in sales, marketing, and leadership 6 days a week. It is the last day of the month today. Have you finished the month already? Or are you still scrambling to pull on that last deal before the month ends? Well, joining me on the show for the first time is Chris Ortolano. He's a sales productivity partner at Outbound Edge. He's also the chapter president of the AA-ISP in Portland, Oregon. So we're going to talk about sales productivity. And might expect that since he's a sales productivity partner. And we're going to talk about how do you measure it? Sales productivity. How do you measure sales productivity? It's not as straightforward as you might think. And we're also going to talk about why sales reps really need to understand what their productivity is in order to improve their performance. If you'd like to see the show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/526. There we provide a time-stamped breakdown of this and all the conversations you hear on Accelerate. Make sure you check it out. And if you like this show, of course, it would really help us out if you subscribed, left a review for us. You can do those all on the podcast app on the phone you're using to listen to this podcast. So go ahead, hit pause, subscribe, leave your quick review, and then come right back. I'll be waiting for you. So let's jump right into it. Chris Ortolano, welcome to Accelerate.
Thanks, Andy. It's a pleasure to join you here.
Pleasure to have you. Where are you joining us from today?
Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Well, I love that town. That is just a fun place.
Come visit someday. We'd love to see you.
Well, I've been, and yes, now that you and I have met each other prior to the show, but we hadn't met each other a few months ago, we'll definitely do that. So, all right, standard opening question. So part of my ongoing research project is a question I ask all my guests. In your opinion, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
I think we're overwhelmed with information.
Overwhelmed with information. Okay. And is it because there's some people think that, reps are distracted because they're spending too much time on useless information, or they're overwhelmed with information that's being pushed toward them?
I think it's being pushed, and they don't have an opportunity to classify it into any kind of body of knowledge. And so we're depending on our memory, but we also know that we can get overwhelmed and lose track of things. So we need to create context, I think, for learning so that people can create methods of memorizing. We just talked earlier about mnemonics, that is using short symbols or strings of letters to help us remember important techniques.
And so when you're saying that's being pushed toward them, is this from their marketing department, saying, hey, here are leads, here's content, here's whatever, or are they getting it from both sides, from buyers as well? Where's it coming from?
So I'm going to just broadly use a metaphor to describe sales as I see it today. It's a combination of three things, perhaps. You've got to be one part politician, one part tango dancer, and one part air traffic controller.
Okay.
If you've ever done a tango dance, you know that you have to become quite personal with somebody in a very short period. This is somebody that you don't know. And there's a certain communication style that lends itself to opening up. But amidst all of that, there's all these planes moving around, and these are your product development teams, your sales and marketing executives, and of course the markets themselves. Mm-hmm. The markets are very dynamic. So if we don't know our industry, how can we talk to our customers? We need a way to keep up with their changes also. And then finally, the politics is really about making deals. We have to know how to get people to sit at the table. We have to listen to their concerns. We have to find a way to create some beneficial agreement that results in an outcome that we're all satisfied with. These are difficult skills to master individually, but when you put them all together, it can be overwhelming. So we need to create guidelines, I think, especially for some of our newer reps.
Got it. So you recently started, not so recently, but you started an online sales community.
Yeah, thanks for asking. SalesStack is a free forum for practitioners and leaders to create a learning community. We basically ask each other questions about a lot about sales technology, but also about process and metrics and outcomes. And it's created an experience where we can, meet each other in real life. SalesStack has been very powerful for me. It's taught me a lot. It's taught me how to listen, in fact.
Interesting. So what was the motivation to start it? I mean, there's no other forum similar. I mean, and I think you and I are probably members on a couple other similar forums, so at least I see your name on there occasionally.
Yeah, so I have to give credit to Jason Vargas and George Soto. Early on, they were willing to get on the phone with us, do some private webinars and tweet chats to transfer some of the knowledge out of the Silicon Valley up here to Portland, Oregon. We're a small market. We have, maybe 50 sales leaders, and we were craving some of their knowledge. They suggested that we put together the Slack team, so we did, and we went from 25 to 250 and now over 1,000 because people want to have kind of a personal environment to chat and also ask questions and share content and bring their friends in. And that creates this ongoing learning or continuous learning environment that we feel is very helpful.
So what are the primary topics that people want to chat about on the forum?
Great question. Yeah, so a lot of it is how to get your first sales development team up and running. So we talk about hiring, onboarding, the ramp period, what does continuous training look like, but also how do we build our sales stack? There's a plethora of tools out there. And then we talk about metrics. How do we measure progress? So we have a number of people who contribute on a regular basis, and these are our leaders, and then we get, on average, about 2 or 3 new people a day. I'd say the split is between established and new startups. So, not quite growth, but certainly have raised a round, and then we have a number of startups who are just considering sales and sales development for the very first time, and we want to help them avoid making some of the most common mistakes.
So I had a question I wanted to ask you about that, because as I said, in communities like this, as I scan the topics and the discussion threads and so on, and the topics that are being discussed, what I find interesting is that, as you sort of just said, is that it seems like about 95% of the threads are about process, tech, structure, metrics, comp plans, and so on. And only about 5 to 10% are about the buyer. And to me, that's almost like, okay, asking myself, is that a sort of a commentary about sort of where we are today in sales?
Yeah, I think we assume that we know about the buyer, and we have not really learned to think about the buyer. Most training that I've experienced or heard of is really product and process focused. So that begs the question, why don't we listen more to our customers? So I've done some interviews, which I call customer data stories, where I ask people to tell me the steps that they took to engage with a vendor, evaluate the market, and then what shift occurred within key KPIs. This idea of data and data stories is still not popular because I think we're oriented around an older sales model, which is kind of, maybe based out of the 20th century, where you have a high activity, high volume process, and the buyer is more or less assumed once the deal is closed. But really, I would suggest that SaaS and selling SaaS is more of an hourglass than a funnel. And so we need to pay much closer attention. And I think that the opportunity to do that, especially with a knowledge base, is still wide open at this point.
Well, it raises an interesting question, because as I look at research reports that come out, and again, people probably listening to this may be sick of me talking about this subject, but we see all this wonderful technology, these plethora of tools coming in that are available for sales, from start to finish in the sales process, customer success as well. But like I said, there's no real report that I've seen that sort of indicates that we're really, all this technology is having the impact of really moving the needle in terms of overall sales performance across our profession.
In fact, it's not.
Right. So when we make the comment, say, well, sort of assume sort of about the buyer, when I see that all these discussions are oriented around everything except how do I actually make a gosh darn sale, it's like, okay, are we trying to hide behind the tools? Because I get a sense of that from, with companies I work with and the sales professionals I work with, that, and I don't want to say it's purely generational, because it's not, is that, people people want to hide behind the tools. It's almost like, sales is famous for making excuses, right? It's one of the ironies about sales is there's no other profession where it's, your success or your livelihood is so much based directly on your efforts. Yet, salespeople are the most prolific when it comes to excuses of why they don't get things done.
Yeah, I would suggest that we're in transition. So we do see some companies, for example, MuleSoft, they just went public this year, creating inside sales academies to really understand their buyers. So they moved away from a volume and velocity model to really allowing their top funnel prospectors to build relationships and build discovery skills. And I think that was a conscious choice that executives at that company and others like them have made. And I think until we start to look at data and realize that kind of investment that they do also at Adobe and Burst, that kind of investment in our frontline sales reps is paying off, that we're not going to be so familiar with how to understand the buyer. But I know that as we create more of these academy models, you see them in companies like Discover.org, that we'll start to see more benefit there.
Yeah, well, I think it's, and you and I have talked about this in the past when we've met, is that, sales is still about a person talking to a person. And I'm heartened to hear, something like a company like MuleSoft and others are beginning to spend more time investing in that, because technology should be used in support of making that moment as effective as possible. And, ask questions of CEOs, founders of, some company come out with the latest tool. And it's like, okay, well, how does this help the buyer make a decision?
Yeah, I think we need a framework. So I came up with a kind of a 5-part framework, if you will, for thinking about how to talk to buyers. So the first part would be to have some sense of curiosity. And we spoke earlier on this call about pausing and listening. And I think curiosity leads to collaboration. I think that many buyers are very sophisticated. It does not take long for me to create a matrix of similar tools. But you need to collaborate with me before I'm willing to make a commitment to you. That's the third step. And what I'm looking for, if I'm a buyer, is somebody that can help me make a change inside my company. That is, in my opinion, the most difficult thing to do. And that requires exceptional communication skills. And Andy, many of us do not have exceptional communication skills. We've never studied communication in college. We don't practice like actors and writers do on a daily basis. And yet that's really what it boils down to, is how well we communicate.
But I don't want to interrupt step 5, but I just want to insert is salespeople do practice every day.
Yeah, but I think there's a false sense of security there. I honestly don't think that doing the work is practicing. Just because I show up and make 100 phone calls doesn't mean that I'm getting any better at my craft.
Well, yeah, if you're not curious, you're never going to learn from what's going on.
Yeah, so I coach salespeople on a regular basis, and it continues to amaze me how little time people put in after hours or on the weekends doing basic things, say writing a narrative story. So there's this concept that Daniel Pink described called the Pixar pitch, where we use 6 elements to tell a story. Why? Because stories live in our brains longer than, say, features and benefits. This is a very simple process. You can read about it in his book, To Sell is Human, but very few people will actually practice that process. I think we need to embrace sales as a craft that we have to practice, not just do.
Well, you raise an interesting point, though, and I think this is one of the dilemmas, is that we say, as you just said, look, reps aren't investing enough of their time on weekends and so on to improve their craft, improve their, the professional development. Why should it be up to them on their time to do that? Why not, as some companies do, is say, we're going to invest time. We're going to take time out of the sales day because we know, hey, we're only spending 30, 35% of the time anyway actually talking to a customer. If that, we're going to take some of that time and we're going to invest it in you.
Completely agreed.
But we got a ton of pushback. I mean, I have a program I sell with companies that it's a 10-book reading curriculum, but I only work with companies that agreed to invest time during the business day to give people time to read it. And we asked for 20 minutes every day, 15 minutes to read and 5 minutes to reflect in a journal about what they just read. And hugely, hugely beneficial to teams that go through that. But yeah, more often than not, I mean, 90% of the time, a sales leader will push back and say, yeah, we don't have time for that.
Yeah, I think that you're on the leading edge of a trend that more and more companies are wanting to do this. So I know Outreach is doing this in association with Jacco van der Kooi at Winning by Design. They know that investing in their frontline staff has huge rewards. But until we can measure that, other companies may be skeptical. So it may be incumbent upon the individual to make use of all this rich information, the podcasts, the webinars. That's how I got started, and adopt a self-learning approach. And then hopefully that will spread throughout their peers and even to their managers. I think there's a bit of a bottleneck, as I said earlier. There's so much information, particularly our managers are overwhelmed with forecasts and pipeline reviews and spreadsheets that they may not have the time to develop the kind of learning curriculum or knowledge base to feed the necessary skills and development inside a company. If you don't have that access inside your company, you can certainly create it on your own.
Absolutely. I mean, sure. Ideally, we'd love people to invest some of their own time, some of their own money, even in learning. You clearly have done it. I've done it. But, we always have this sort of issue as we say, okay, well, we've got this great middle, if you will, but not the top performers, not the bottom performers, that are the people we think have the potential to become the next level. And there's this reticence to actually put your money where your mouth is and actually invest in them, because we're assuming, and often in the show, I get guests who say the same thing as, people aren't investing enough of their own time. And I always have the same answer, which is, or question is, that'd be great if they did, but why aren't we investing in them?
We're stuck in an archaic model, which is you just hire somebody, give them a week or two of training, and then if they don't work out after 90, 180 days, you fire them. Mm-hmm. And I call that the hire to fire model. And probably sales as we know it started with that approach. Why? Sure. Because you churn through enough people and you're going to get a few A players, and they're going to carry the team, right?
Exactly. Well, that is the model. I mean, when I got started, the company I worked for at the time was the second largest computer company in the world. That's IBM did the same thing at the same time. That's exactly what they did. They went and hired hundreds of new college grads every year and put them through a program knowing full well that 90% of them were going to wash out over 2 years. And they were okay with that.
And sadly, many VPs moved up through the ranks that way, and they still make the decisions. But a few companies are realizing that knowledge is actually a powerful fulcrum, and that they can actually train to retain. And they will recruit top talent and provide them with a 1 or 2 year growth plan where their progress is measured not only on productivity, but on their ability to learn and also teach. And so this is the cutting edge, in my opinion. And in 5 years, this model will be proven. Right now, companies are investing on their own dime. So I got to give a shout out to Eli Cohen. He held a productivity summit early April in Fort Mason, and he had large companies represent. Exactly was one talk about their journey to develop a training model, and they all took some time away from productivity to figure out this model, and it was difficult. But in the end, they were rewarded with their time and effort, and that's contributing to scaling sales. It takes time on our part. We have to have a commitment. And Eli and some of his customers have done a great job of sharing their stories. And I think we need to circulate those stories a little bit more.
Well, you raised interesting words that you and I have talked about in the past, which is productivity. So I guess the question for you is, do we really have a handle on what constitutes sales productivity?
It's a new phrase. I'll, throw out my 2 cents. I think we need to look at productivity as some correlation between leading and lagging indicators. So leading indicators are the training, the coaching, the learning and development that helps to make our process more specific and more effective. And then can we correlate that with some increase in conversion, say at the top of the funnel, or opportunities, or ultimately revenue? We know it comes down to closed won. I've seen spreadsheets where people are doing this, but I don't think we have a science yet. I think people are still trying to determine, is it worth it, as you suggest earlier, to take 20 minutes out of our day? Oh, wait a minute. I think we can correlate that 20 minutes with a higher quality conversation, or getting more decision makers into the deal earlier on, moving the deals faster. Yeah, I see until we can prove that correlation a little bit more, I think productivity is still open to interpretation.
Well, how would you define productivity?
It's a correlation between the leading and the lagging. Yeah, I mean,
but see, I think one of the issues we have in sales is that we have no idea what productivity means. So, I mean, look at productivity from an economic standpoint. It's a unit of output for a unit of input, right? So we're producing X amount of goods for a unit of labor. So why wouldn't we look at sales the same way?
Yeah, I think that is a sort of a factory, a metaphor that comes out of industrialization. But
we look at it as a measure of gross productivity, and given the fact that we have our economy is increasingly dominated by a service economy, but it still has value. So
in accounting, because I wanted to understand financial statements, I thought I still do think that's an excellent window, if you will, into the health of a company. But one thing you don't see on the balance sheet is any reference to talent. So just because I'm growing 15 or 20% year over year, there's no reference to how the people are important to that process. So we're knowledge workers. And I think it's important to start to assign a value to knowledge. And I think that we intrinsically know that knowledge is valuable. We respect somebody who is very intelligent. They give a TED Talk, they write a book. But I think knowledge is more than just book learning these days. I think there's a sense of community. I think there's organic knowledge, which is this sharing of ideas. I think there's structured knowledge, which we see in a lot of our sort of role-based learning. And I think there's huge potential there, honestly, to increase productivity, that is, to increase output by focusing some of our attention on how to apply knowledge and knowledge systems inside our organizations.
Okay. There's a lot there to unpack. So is one of the trends that you're worried about that people are substituting data for knowledge?
Yeah, I think data is it's very appealing. As you said earlier, it's quantifiable, but it does not represent the whole story. So I'm keen on data stories. So if someone shows me a spreadsheet, I say, well, what's the narrative behind this? And then can you include that narrative in your discussion? This is similar to a 10K, where a company describes the year's activities and creates a bit of a SWOT analysis to characterize why the year went the way it did. I think we need to use data to test our hypotheses. And I think knowledge and learning is essentially a test. Companies are laboratories, but we need to run tests, not just assume that knowledge is limited to an LMS, for example.
Well, when you're talking about tests, give an example.
So your book club or your 10-book curriculum is certainly a test for somebody that's never deployed a curriculum like that inside their organization. Mm-hmm. And so they have to take a risk, and they're going to manage some risk. If there's 100 people times 20 minutes, that's 30 hours, 33 hours a week. You can equate that with some potential revenue. So I'm hoping to get more revenue than I would for having those 33 hours on the phone. I think we can measure that. I think we can suggest that it's worth it, because during the day we're going to see a more focused approach, and we can test certain outcomes. We can look at writing skills, for example. Ralph Barcy at Topo Summit said, teach your sales and sales development teams how to write. I think that's the single most important skill that many of us are lacking. I think we all know what to write, but I think we can all improve on how we write it. And can we measure that? Yeah, I think we can measure that in terms of the responses that we get when we send out emails or series of emails. If I write a better email, do I get a response sooner? Do I get a higher quality response? I think we could test that.
Well, yeah. Yeah, undoubtedly, I think we could. Yeah, I'm sort of, I have to admit, I mean, one of these people is starting to say, okay, look, you're saying we're being overwhelmed. One of the things we're overwhelmed with increasingly is data. And it's sort of the point you were just making, I think you were making just a bit ago, is that I think where we struggle is as sales leaders and as salespeople, we don't know how to make sense of much of the data that we get, right? Because we have a tendency as humans to sort of say, yeah, let's use that data to confirm our current narrative, which is a comfortable thing we do, and we sort of default position we use as just the way we think as humans. But it's, we don't dig sort of to find the story behind the data, as you just talked about.
Yeah, Brian Lambert and I had a conversation about this about 8 months ago about cognitive bias within organizations.
And Brian is who?
Brian Lambert, he is with Oxygen. They're a learning and development consultancy based out of Seattle. You should definitely make an introduction to him. He's brilliant in his assessment of how companies learn or don't learn. Mm-hmm. And he's very keen on creating a culture of understanding the customer and customer outcomes.
And so what was your conversation about the data?
So we were talking about learning culture and how there's cognitive bias and that we are afraid to essentially challenge the bias. So if there's a sales-driven culture, then maybe there's less emphasis on product, or vice versa. You could have engineering sort of driving the culture. So we need to figure out language that works for these different cultures, and then really allow them to share knowledge. We both agree that silos may be one of the most limiting aspects of quote, modern organizations. We feel like there's a need to break down those silos, and we feel like sharing ideas about customers is one way to do that. So customer narratives, customer testimonials, customer data stories are all valuable, but they typically don't get shared inside companies. And so we were asking maybe what are some ways that we could create more of a sharing of knowledge around customers inside an organization.
So if you were to look at the way, and you've referenced it several times, so you think that at least in the tech industry that you and I sort of, you more directly than I work in is that we're sort of stuck in a sales model that's old, it's creaky, it's taking on water. So if you're going to say, look, let's reimagine these silos or reimagine the functions to get rid of the silos, how would you restructure sales?
Yeah, so sales is, in my opinion, the job of a sales rep is to convert what I call general sales intelligence. This is all the data that we can use to create a hypothesis, a general idea, into what I call critical sales intelligence. This is more like a detective, putting together clues, trying to bring many different disciplines inside the customer account together to understand what their priorities are, their initiatives. So I think we need to teach our sales reps about the different functions inside an account. One of the best ways to do this is to onboard your new reps with a real good introduction to, say, what the finance function is, what the product development function is, what the HR function is. The companies are matrixed a lot more, in my opinion, than we are trained to believe. When we talk about buyer's consensus, there's people from many different business units helping to achieve consensus. And in my opinion, not understanding A, the business model, and B, the domain knowledge that is specifically, if you're in cybersecurity, you need to understand cybersecurity. Those two critical elements, I think, are really key to transforming sales. And we do not invest enough in training our reps with business savvy and domain knowledge.
Well, last question for you, because unfortunately we're getting to the end of our time, is why does that persist? I mean, it's not like there's a lack of a self-awareness that I think in general among sales leaders that they're not investing enough in training reps, let's say, about their products that they sell, services they sell, as well as about the customer.
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit of irrational exuberance, not to be negative, but we're in the midst of, say, phase one of sales automation, which is access to really rich contact data that we've never had before. We're able to pinpoint some general hypothesis around people and persona, roles inside a company, but we are really at the beginning of trying to understand what's going on inside a company. So I've got to give a shout out to David Brock at the Topo Summit. He said, companies have more or less ability to change, more or less ability to evolve, if you will. And I kind of coined this as a maturity index. I think that we need to understand how much a company can change. And there's no amount of data that can share that. The only way we can learn that is by engaging in conversation. So it comes back to the communication skills, in my opinion. We need to understand what our customers are going through, what their pain is, how they make decisions. What does consensus look like inside their organizations? And honestly, I think we as salespeople could do better at preparing ourselves for that kind of conversation.
Okay. This is going to be my last question because I cut you off before. We only got through 4 of your 5 C's. So let me recap. Curiosity, collaboration, commitment, and communication skills. The 5th one is?
Change. Sales in its sort of simplest form is about change management.
Yep.
And you cannot do step 5 without the first 4 steps.
All right. That's what I figured it was, but glad that we came back and asked. So, Chris, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to have to come back again soon. We'll continue our conversation. But in the meantime, tell people how they can connect with you and learn more about you.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is salesnerdo. That is NERDO. And from there, you can click to Sales Stack on Twitter, and there's a URL. You can join our sales community. It's a thriving group. We engage in daily QA around some of these topics, many of them around how to get your sales playbooks started. We had a rich conversation on that yesterday. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn, Chris Ortolano, Ortolano. I'd be more than happy to link in with you, have some conversations, and I'm curious to learn what challenges your listeners are trying to solve.
All right, Chris, thanks again. And friends, thank you for spending this time with us today. Remember, come back, join me again tomorrow. Another great episode of Accelerate lined up for you. Until then, if you get a chance, please go to iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast, subscribe to this show, leave us a review. We want to hear from you about what we could do to make it even more valuable experience for you. So thanks again for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.